Episode 6 Jaakko Puntus, the Shepherd Warrior. There is a name that echoes across the Karelian landscape, carved not only in the furrows of impossible fields and the stones of ancient bridges but in the memory of people who still speak it with something approaching reverence. Jaakko Puntus. Or Pontus, or Puntuxin Jaakko, the name shifts slightly from village to village, from generation to generation, but the essence remains constant. He was the shepherd who became a warrior, the clever one who defeated giants through cunning rather than strength, the builder who shaped the landscape itself, leaving marks that persist a millennium after his time. Theodor Schwint, walking through the villages around Lake Ladoga in the summer of 1879, heard the name everywhere. At Hämeenlahti, where the old men spoke of battles at Lakelanlahti. At Turvu, where they showed him the furrows, platform high, impossibly deep, that only a giant or a very determined man could have plowed. At Jaakima, where the entire region was said to bear his name, Jaakonmaa, Jaakko's land. At Miklin, where ancient works stretched toward Olenitz, testifying to labor on an epic scale. Always the same figure, but the stories varied. Sometimes he was fully human, a shepherd boy who rose through cleverness. Sometimes he was one of the Metellalaiset, the giants who preceded the Karelians. Sometimes he was simply Puntus, without need of explanation, as if his name alone carried sufficient meaning. What all the stories agreed on was this: Jaakko Puntus defended his people. Not empires, not distant rulers, not abstract causes, but the communities who lived on this land, who spoke this language, who called this place home. But to the Finnish people he did nothing bad, the old storytellers said. This line appears repeatedly in the folklore Schwint collected, a constant refrain that defines the essence of who Puntus was and what he represented. This is the story of Jaakko Puntus, shepherd, warrior, builder, trickster, eternal guardian. This is the story of how one name came to represent the stubborn survival of a borderland people, and why, more than 1,000 years after he supposedly lived, his presence still shapes the land. The shepherd's beginning. The story begins, as so many hero tales do, with humble origins. Jaakko Puntus was a paimenpoika, a shepherd boy, tending flocks in the hills around what would later become Jaakima. This detail appears consistently across the variants, and it matters. He was not born to power or privilege. He was not a prince or a warrior's son. He was ordinary, the kind of person who would be invisible in the grand chronicles of empires and kings. But shepherding, in the folklore imagination, is never merely about tending sheep. Shepherds spend long hours alone in marginal spaces, the edges of wilderness, the boundaries between settled land and the unknown. They learn to read landscapes, to notice what others miss, to survive through observation and adaptation rather than force. And shepherds, crucially, are responsible for protecting vulnerable things. The flock depends entirely on the shepherd's vigilance, cleverness, and willingness to face threats that are larger and more powerful. The shepherd cannot defeat the wolf through strength alone, he must be smarter, faster, more cunning. This is the foundational image, the young Jaakko Puntus, staff in hand, watching the hills, learning the land, developing the qualities that would later make him legendary. Not strength, cleverness. Not power, responsibility. Not conquest, protection. The shepherd who would become the defender of his people. The warrior hero, defender of the people. The martial dimension of Jaakko Puntus's legend centers on his role as defender, not of kingdoms, but of communities. Not for glory, but for survival. The landscape around Lake Ladoga was a borderland, contested for centuries between Swedish and Russian spheres of influence. Control shifted repeatedly. Wars came and went. And the people who lived here, the Karelian communities, the Finnish-speaking villages, found themselves subject to different rulers at different times, caught in conflicts that were not of their making. In such a world, loyalty becomes complicated. A person might find themselves nominally Swedish subjects one decade, Russian the next, then Swedish again, all without moving an inch from the village where their ancestors had lived for generations. Official allegiance meant little when it changed with each treaty. What mattered was survival, community, the protection of the people who actually lived on the land. Jaakko Puntus, the folklore suggests, navigated this complexity by maintaining one unwavering allegiance to his people, regardless of which empire claimed to rule them. He may have served different masters at different times, the stories don't specify and seem deliberately uninterested in such details. He might have been in Swedish service during one conflict, Russian during another. The empires and their banners mattered little. What remained constant, what the folklore insists upon with remarkable consistency, is this: to the Finnish people, to the Karelian communities, to those who shared his language and his land, he did nothing bad. His violence was directed outward, protecting his own, never serving imperial interests at the expense of his communities. This makes Puntus a far more interesting and realistic figure than a simple patriotic hero fighting for one side against another. He represents the experience of borderland peoples everywhere, those caught between larger powers, forced to navigate imperial conflicts while maintaining loyalty to something deeper and more enduring: the communities themselves, the land itself, the people who would remain long after the current emperor or king was forgotten. The battles attributed to him stretch across a wide geography. At Vakokangas he fought, the stories say he battled there but rarely specify against whom, because the identity of the enemy mattered less than the fact of defense. His martial presence extended from Vakokangas all the way to Lassina. The site where Jaakima's agricultural college now stands was supposedly another battlefield. What's consistent across all these accounts is not which banner he served under, but that when his people needed protection, he provided it. When raiders came, Swedish forces sweeping east, Russian armies pushing west, opportunistic bands taking advantage of chaos, Puntus defended the villages. That's what the stories remember and what they insist upon. He was not a soldier of Sweden or Russia but a defender of Karelia, and his loyalty was to the land and its people, not to the crowns that fought over it. The trickster, defeating giants. But Jaakko Puntus was not primarily a warrior in the conventional sense. He was not remembered for overwhelming strength or for winning through superior force. Instead, the stories emphasize his cleverness, his ability to defeat larger, stronger opponents through cunning and guile. The most famous story, collected at Turvu, captures this essential quality. Puntus encountered a giant, one of those impossibly large men, perhaps one of the Metellalasit themselves, perhaps simply an enemy warrior of great size and strength. In direct combat, Puntus would have no chance. The giant was simply too powerful. So Puntus didn't fight fairly. He challenged the giant to a stone-throwing contest. The giant, confident in his strength, agreed. The giant threw first, hurling a massive stone high into the air. Then came Puntus's turn. As the giant looked skyward, watching to see how high and far the shepherd could throw, Jaakko simply smashed the stone directly into the giant's forehead. The giant fell. Clever defeated strong. The shepherd warrior won through trickery. With such tricks he killed many people, the storyteller told Schwint, not through strength, but through cunning. Not through overwhelming force, but through understanding his opponent's expectations and subverting them. This is David and Goliath, but without divine intervention. This is the eternal story of the smaller, weaker party finding ways to survive against larger, more powerful forces. This is how borderland peoples, caught between empires, lacking the resources of either, managed to persist. Jaakko Puntus, in these trickster stories, embodies asymmetric warfare, a refusal to play by rules designed to ensure his defeat. He wins not because he's stronger but because he's smarter, not because he has superior resources but because he understands that survival sometimes requires cunning over honor, tricks over direct confrontation. And crucially, his trickery is always directed outward. The stories insist on this. He killed many enemies through such methods, yes, but to his own people, he did nothing bad. His cunning was protective, defensive, employed in service of community survival rather than personal gain or aggression. The trickster hero is a common figure in the folklore of oppressed or marginalized peoples. When you cannot win through strength, you win through cleverness. When the game is rigged against you, you change the rules. When your enemies are larger and more powerful, you make them underestimate you, then strike when they're looking the wrong direction. Jaakko Puntus, the shepherd boy who defeated giants by hitting them with rocks when they weren't looking, represents this survival strategy elevated to heroic status. The builder, shaping the land. But Puntus was not only a warrior and trickster. Perhaps his most enduring legacy, the one most visible in the physical landscape, is his work as a builder, or more accurately, as a shaper of the land itself. At Vakokangas in Miklin, there are furrows in the earth described as platform high, far deeper and more dramatic than any normal plowing could create. The people who showed them to Schwind were certain, Jaakko Puntus made these. He plowed them, driving his plow so deep into the earth that the furrows persist centuries later, still visible, still testimony to work on an almost superhuman scale. From Miklin, Puntus's works extended toward Olenitz, a vast distance, suggesting labor sustained over years or decades. He cleared forests, the stories say, working the land from Karelia all the way into what is now Russia. He built bridges across impossible terrain. The stories speak of Siltoja Soiden Ili, bridges over marshes, and Taita Kivikojan Lapi, roads through boulder fields. These were not trivial undertakings. Building a functional bridge across a marsh required understanding of terrain, materials, engineering principles that would not be formalized for centuries. Clearing a path through boulder fields required patience, determination, and the kind of sustained labor that transforms landscape. At Nila Silta, a bridge over a bog is attributed to Puntus. Whether he literally built this specific structure matters less than what the attribution represents. When people encountered ancient works whose origins were lost to time, works of such scale and skill that they seemed beyond ordinary human capability, they said, Jaakko Puntus made this. The name became synonymous with transformative labor, with the kind of work that shapes land itself, that creates infrastructure benefiting communities for generations. This builder aspect of the Puntus legend connects to the Metellelezit traditions discussed in earlier episodes. The giants were remembered as the first shapers of the landscape, the ones who cleared the initial fields and built the first fortifications. By attributing similar works to Puntus, or by suggesting he might himself be one of the Metellelezit, the folklore places him in a lineage of those who transformed wilderness into inhabited land. At Miklin, one storyteller explicitly called Puntus a Metellelainen. This might be literal, he was one of those earlier, larger people. Or it might be metaphorical, his works were of such scale that only giants or those who worked like giants could have accomplished them. Either way, the message is clear, Jaakko Puntus was a builder, one whose works endured, whose labor benefited communities long after he was gone, who changed the land in ways that lasted. The name giver, Jaakko Ma. Perhaps the most ambitious claim made for Jaakko Puntus is that he gave his name to an entire region. At Jaakima, Schwind heard this tradition, the name of the parish, Jaakima, derives from Jaakko Ma, Jaakko's land. The entire area was named for Puntus because he dwelt there for a long time, maintaining his camp at Lippumäki, where the parsonage now stands. His camp, the stories say, was at Lippumäki itself, while his troops were stationed across the river at Veltkankala, between the church and Veltsilta bridge. This suggests not a solitary hero but a leader, someone who commanded others, who established a semi-permanent military presence in the region. If true, if Jaakima really does derive from Jaakko's name, this would make his presence foundational, not merely legendary but literally inscribed in the geography, shaping identity and memory at the most basic level. Whether the etymology is accurate or folk etymology, which seems more likely, the name Jaakima probably has other origins. The fact that people believed this connection tells us something important. Jaakko Puntus was understood as fundamentally linked to the land, as someone whose presence defined a place, whose name belonged to the landscape itself. The eternal guardian, presence that persists. What emerges from all these stories, the shepherd, the warrior, the trickster, the builder, the name giver, is a figure who transcends simple historical existence. Jaakko Puntus might have been a real person. There might have been an actual shepherd warrior in the early medieval period, someone whose exploits were remarkable enough to enter folk memory. Or the name might have attached to multiple people across time, a title or designation rather than an individual. Or the figure might be entirely legendary, a personification of qualities the community valued. In a sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is what Jaakko Puntus represents, the defender who serves the community rather than empires, the clever one who defeats stronger enemies through wit, the laborer whose works outlast his lifetime, the presence that shapes landscape and memory, the guardian who remains even after death. The stories Schwind collected in 1879 were told by people whose grandparents had heard them from their grandparents, who had heard them from theirs, reaching back into a past beyond precise dating. Puntus's time was long ago, in that mythological period when giants still walked and the world was different. Whether that means the 1100s or the 800s or some earlier time, no one could say with certainty. But the stories persisted. And they persisted because they addressed needs that remained constant across generations: the need for defenders when empires warred, the need for cleverness when strength was insufficient, the need for labor that transformed wilderness into home, the need for heroes who were loyal to people rather than rulers. In every generation, the Lake Ladoga Karelians faced threats: Swedish armies, Russian forces, raiders, conflicts not of their making. In every generation, they needed to believe that someone like Jaakko Puntus existed, that the clever shepherd warrior was watching, that the defender of the people had not entirely vanished. And in a sense, he hadn't. Because the stories kept him present. The furrows at Vakokangas testified to his labor. The bridges over marshes bore his mark. The very name Jakima connected people to his memory. The landscape itself became a text recording his existence, and as long as people could walk to Vakokangas and see the furrows, could cross the bridge at Nilasilta, could stand at Lippumäki where his camp supposedly stood, Jaakko Puntus remained real in a way that transcended mere historical fact. The greater pattern, what Puntus represents. Place Jaakko Puntus within the larger pattern of stories Schwind collected, and his significance becomes even clearer. The Metellalasit shaped the primordial landscape, creating the foundations of inhabited space. The fortress builders constructed defenses, creating communal refuges. The survivors like Vepsa endured impossible situations, testifying to human resilience. The daughters at Imphara claimed agency in the darkest moment, transforming victimhood into guardianship. Jaakko Puntus synthesizes all these qualities. He is builder like the giants, warrior like the fortress defenders, clever survivor like Vepsa, eternal guardian like the daughters. He represents the complete hero, the one who embodies every quality needed for communal survival in a dangerous borderland. And crucially, he is specifically not aligned with either of the empires that fought over this territory. He serves neither Swedish nor Russian masters ultimately, though he might have fought under both banners at different times. His allegiance is to something more fundamental: the land and the people who live on it. This makes Puntus a deeply subversive figure, actually. In a borderland contested by empires, where loyalty was supposed to flow upward to distant rulers, Puntus's loyalty flows horizontally, to community, to fellow villagers, to the Karelian people regardless of which empire claims sovereignty. But to the Finnish people he did nothing bad. This line, repeated across variants, is revolutionary in its implications. It suggests a form of identity and loyalty that transcends imperial categories, that persists across political changes, that defines community by language and land and shared experience rather than by whoever currently controls the territory. Jaakko Puntus is, in this sense, a national hero before the concept of nation in its modern sense existed. He represents a people, not a state, not a kingdom, not an empire, but a people defined by language and landscape and culture, a people whose identity persisted even as borders shifted around them. The historical shadow: was there a real Puntus? The question inevitably arises: was there a historical Jaakko Puntus? The honest answer is, we cannot know, and in some ways the question misses the point. The stories place him in a period too early for reliable historical documentation of individual warriors in this region. The medieval records that do exist focus on rulers, on political entities, on the movements of kingdoms rather than on local defenders. A shepherd warrior fighting to protect Karelian villages would not appear in Swedish or Russian chronicles unless his actions affected imperial interests in some documented way. What we can say is this: the tradition is old. The attribution of landscape features to Puntus suggests the stories were already established by the time people needed to explain ancient earthworks and bridges. The geographic spread of the stories, from Mikland to Jakima to Hämeenlahti, suggests a figure of regional rather than merely local significance. And the stories have the flavor of genuine folk memory rather than literary invention. They're fragmented, contradictory in details, localized to specific landscapes. They lack the polish of composed narrative and have instead the roughness of tradition transmitted orally across generations, changing slightly with each telling but maintaining a core consistency. Whether this folk memory preserves actual events or whether Jaakko Puntus is an amalgam, multiple historical defenders compressed into a single legendary figure, is perhaps unanswerable. Quite possibly, the name attached to different people at different times, becoming a kind of title or designation for certain types of heroes, and eventually crystallizing into a single legendary personage. But the historical question, while interesting, is less important than the cultural function. Whether or not an individual named Jaakko Puntus lived in the 1100s, the stories about him served crucial purposes for the communities who told them. They provided a hero who represented their values, who modeled the kind of loyalty and courage they needed, who testified that their people had always defended themselves and always would. In that sense, Jaakko Puntus was real regardless of historical existence. He was real in the landscape, real in the stories, real in the communal identity he helped to shape. The legacy: what remains? When Schwint walked through the villages in 1879, collecting these stories, he was documenting something already fading. The old men who told him about Jaakko Puntus had heard the stories from their grandfathers, who had heard them from theirs. The direct line of oral transmission was thinning. And after 1879, the 20th century would bring catastrophes that would further fragment the tradition. The Russian Revolution, the Finnish Civil War, the Winter War and Continuation War, and finally the forced population transfers of 1944 that emptied the Karelian villages and scattered their inhabitants across Finland and Russia. The landscape where Jaakko Puntus supposedly dwelt changed hands, became Soviet territory, was repopulated by people who did not know the old stories, who could not read the landscape in the old ways. But the stories themselves survived, preserved in Schwint's meticulous fieldwork, in the folklore archives, in the memories of displaced Karelians who taught their children and grandchildren about the hero who once defended these lands. And remarkably, some of the physical traces persist. The furrows at Vakokangas can still be seen, or could, until very recently, as landscape changes continue. The bridges, rebuilt many times, still cross the same marshes Puntus supposedly bridged. The place names, Lippumäki, Vakokangas, Hämeenlahti, remain, even if the people who first knew why those names mattered are gone. In the 21st century, scholars and folklorists still study Jaakko Puntus, still try to untangle the layers of tradition, still search for historical kernels within the legendary accretions. Local heritage enthusiasts visit the sites associated with him, walk the paths he supposedly walked, stand at Lippumäki imagining his camp. The figure endures, adaptable to new contexts, still representing something essential, the defender of community over empire, the clever over the strong, the one who shapes landscape through labor, the guardian whose presence transcends mortality. Coda, the shepherd still watches. Imagine, for a moment, standing at Lippumäki where Schwint was told Jaakko Puntus made his camp. The parsonage stands here now, a structure far more recent than the legend. But the hill itself is ancient, the view across the valley unchanged in its essentials. You can see for miles, strategic ground, the kind of place a military leader would choose for a camp. Or walk to Vakokangas and look at the furrows, impossibly deep, carved into earth that should not bear such marks. Platform high, the old description said. Walk alongside one and try to imagine the labor required to create it, even if you had a modern plow. Then imagine creating it with medieval tools, or earlier. Imagine driving a plow that deep, holding it there, sustaining that effort across fields. Giant's work, or the work of someone who labored like a giant. Or cross the marsh at Nila Silta on the modern bridge, and think about the first person who looked at this impassable bog and decided to make it passable, who engineered a way across, who built something that would serve travelers for generations. In each of these places, Jaakko Puntus is present. Not as ghost, not as literal guardian, but as memory embedded in landscape, as story that gives meaning to geography, as the reminder that this land was shaped by people, defended by people, belongs to the communities who lived here generation after generation regardless of which empire's maps claimed otherwise. The shepherd still watches, in a sense. Not from Lippumäki exactly, not in any physical form, but through the stories that keep his name alive, through the landscape features that bear his mark, through the idea he represents, that communities have defenders, that the clever can defeat the strong, that loyalty to people matters more than loyalty to rulers, that one person's labor can shape land for centuries. Jaakko Puntus, shepherd warrior, trickster builder, eternal guardian of Karelia. His story endures because the need for such heroes never entirely fades. As long as communities face threats, as long as the weak must find ways to survive against the strong, as long as people value loyalty and cleverness and protective labor, the legend of Jaakko Puntus will resonate. The shepherd who became a warrior, who defeated giants through cunning, who shaped the landscape itself, who defended his people regardless of which empire claimed to rule them, this figure speaks to something essential in the human experience of place and community and survival. And so the name echoes still, across the Lake Ladoga landscape, in the stories and the stones and the deep furrows of impossible fields. Jaakko Puntus. Defender of the people. Guardian of the land. The shepherd who still watches, waiting for the next time his people need him.